Listen closely because there'll be a test at the end. State legislators are working on what's being called a dramatic overhaul of standardized testing in Florida schools. This comes after years of complaints. Actual teaching and learning are put on hold when it's time to get students ready for the standardized tests. One idea is to move the testing to the last few weeks of the school year. Another is to eliminate tests dealing with civics, history, geometry, algebra 2, as well as allowing students who do well on the SAT to bypass state testing altogether. Florida has been testing students for decades. Under Governor Jeb Bush, it was expanded, and the growth has continued since he left office. Critics charge some kids learn differently, that standardized tests are not always a good way to assess learning. And joining us for more is Bridget Ziegler of the Sarasota County School Board and Bridget Hefferman-Mendel of the Manatee County Opt-Out Organization. Thank you both for being here. And Bridget, let me start with you. Was your main thrust in terms of getting involved because many students do learn differently and that these standardized tests don't always capture that?
Yes, at the time I was a Manatee County educator, and my biggest concern was seeing my evaluation and that of my colleagues. At the time, it was 40% of our evaluation was based on a one-time test score, a high-stakes test that was not written for students here in Florida, that after the Alpine study was done, was determined that 35% of what was on it was not even aligned to what I was teaching in my classroom.
And as we all know, not only is every student different, but it also depends where the school is, where you're teaching, and the environment. There are a lot of factors that go into it, and to hold, let's say, your merit raises or whatever to that standard is what a lot of teachers have a problem with.
Exactly, and job security. You know, in our turnaround schools, you are asked back in a turnaround school based on your RAM score. That determines whether or not you will be hired and will return in the fall.
And Bridget, I know from my own experience with two kids going through the school system that at some point in the school year, real teaching and learning stops because they have to teach to the test. Kids can't do extra credit. It's information in a way that really is not conducive to real learning. The question is whether pushing these tests back to the final weeks of school is the right idea. Some people believe that by the time we get to May and this time of year, kids are starting already to check out.
Well, and that's fair, but I think, so first and foremost, I think that it's important to have some level of accountability, but also measuring kind of the proficiencies of where we're at. And the debate is up for what does that look like. As far as the timing, right now in the state of Florida, the testing window begins on February 28th. And so if you think about how much time is left for the rest of the year, that's a major concern because it does interrupt instructional time. And as far as to your point about the students checking out, I would rather us have a focus on instructional time and engaging students and then evaluating them at the end of the year than having this focus solely on for about 3 months on testing.
But that's not how we're built. I mean, a lot of effort and a lot of money has gone into this standardized testing. As I said in the setup, we've been doing it for decades, but under Jeb Bush, this became big time in Florida, and it was big business. There was a lot of money involved, and the question is whether we went too far and it was the wrong approach.
Yeah, well, I was just going to, I mean, I think if you go back historically, and I was actually having a conversation not too long ago about this, so if you look at that, why did this culture happen? Because when I was in school, you had a standardized test in 3rd grade and 10th grade, and the culture was not surrounded around these major standardized tests. However, historically, if you look at where we're at in this nationally and also in statewide, there was a large push to really focus on getting us elevated, but that's where the measurement came and the accountability structure. But the culture dramatically shifted, and that's what I think many people on all sides have a major issue with that, because it's taken away the fun component, and it's completely altered the culture of education.
And it was based upon concern that not all kids in all places were learning adequately, and then the question is, how do you measure that? But would you like to see even less standardized testing in our schools?
I would, because I think it's a failed accountability system. I think that trying to, when you look at for example, poverty, one out of every 4 children in the state of Florida lives in poverty. And with poverty comes trauma. and trauma, whether it be incarceration within the family, concern about health, mental health. The stressors that are on a child in poverty are tremendous. And we cannot ask our public schools to cure poverty, but we can ask our public officials to.
All right.
They can.
We are just getting started with this conversation. We'll pick it up after we check the weather, so stay with us. Welcome back. If you're just joining us, we are discussing the Florida Standards Assessment. State legislators are considering moving these tests to the end of the school year. What kind of impact could it have? Our guests tonight are Bridget Ziegler of the Sarasota County School Board and Bridget Heffernan-Mendel of the Manatee County Opt-Out. And Bridget, why don't we start with you, because it is almost, yes.
Me, Bridget?
Yeah. Ziegler.
There you go.
There's so much money and politics behind the standardized testing industrial complex that has been built up for a couple of decades now. The debate in Tallahassee does not seem to be partisan, Republican versus Democrat, but rather, legislators against this industry, which is funneling a lot of money into the state and making a lot of money.
Well, I'd like to divert the conversation back to students and their success and their ability to be proficient and being able to be successful. And that's relevant because I think it constantly goes to the financial component. And that's important, of course. But at the end of the day, education is about providing outcomes.
But it is the reason why changes have not been made yet, despite the fact that many parents and teachers and educators have known for a long time that this is a problem.
Changes in regards to?
In terms of changing the rules, in terms of standardized testing for all the issues that we're talking about.
I don't deny that education, whether we're talking about the testing component, or public education in general, and all the associated vendors and a variety of things that are playing into the part of that. But I would say that that's all very big business, if you will. Government always has been.
But they have a lot of sway.
Indeed, but I think then we need to make that conversation solely focused on the education of students. And there has to be some measure, because if you look at historically, when we have students that can't read and they're graduating high school, that's not in Sarasota County, thank goodness, but there's certainly that's happening. And so I think that's where this culture has changed. It's saying we have to do something. Was the pervasiveness of testing and changing the culture completely the right thing? I don't agree, because I think it's taken a really important component out of education, but there is a level of accountability that has to be done, and I think this is where the debate is what is that balance?
Do you agree with that?
I have 3 words for you. Politics, not proficiency.
Explain.
It's that simple. At this point, poverty, another P word. There's a reason why children end up leaving high school not being able to read. And when we look at poverty and we try to expect our public schools to make poverty go away, it's impossible. It requires all of our public tax dollars to go towards.
But, if I may chime
sure.
in, because the only reason there's certainly external variables all across the board that are going to happen, and that the question remains, can we do anything about it or not? I will implore anybody watching this to look at some of the most amazing case studies in some of the most low-income areas in New York and Harlem that have outstanding achievements, and poverty is directly, that's not preventing them from succeeding. And so I have massive hesitation when that's brought to the table, and it's almost, well, it's really hard, we don't know what we can do because these are the external variables, so that's, and I just think that's setting the bar too low, way too early.
Let me bring up something that Dwayne touched on in this story, and that is the Schools of Hope, which is the proposal to place charter schools in areas where the schools are failing, and many times that is high poverty areas. The argument by opponents of that idea is that if you do that, you are going to be taking away money from the public schools. Bridget, your position?
Most definitely. Charter schools have been around for 30 years. This is a failed educational experiment. If they were that wonderful, why wouldn't we have privatized all of our schools?
Bridget is shaking her head.
Oh, years ago. It's a failed experiment. If we look back to 2000 in the state of Florida, we have spent over $760 million to fund charter schools in this state. There have been over the years approximately 650 charter schools. We lost $70 million of that money to closed and shuttered doors of for-profit corporate charter schools. When schools are accountable to shareholders and we're making a dollar in the backs of our public school children, then they are not working in the best interest of our children.
I adamantly disagree, because if you throw those numbers out, they're big numbers, but how much are we doing to fund public education? Which I'm not trying to choke that, but I'm redirecting the conversation on the students. And you bring up schools of hope, which in Sarasota County we do not have any schools with consecutive D's or F's ratings,
but
which
you
is
do
where
in
it falls
Manatee
into
County, and that's
agreed.
where it comes
And
into play.
and I have been an advocate of schools of hope, because what bothers me is in the state we have districts that have schools that have been failing with D and F grades for a decade. That's a generation. That's a generation of people that are leaving at high school not proficient in basic math and being able to read. We are failing students, and that is, if there's nothing more important for us. And I don't know what, personally, I think that all things are not created equal. Are there great public schools? Yes. Are there poor public schools? Yes. Are there great charter schools? Yes. Are there poor charter schools? Yes. And it goes on and on. So to generalize it is wrong. But what is even more wrong is allowing for students to sit in a school that has been failing them for decades and saying it's okay, let's keep working at it, let's try. At what point do you stop and say we need to do something different?
So, Bridget, therefore, how do you assess in those schools that are facing about where the students are and how the teachers are doing if you do not have standardized tests that could, basically give you those answers?
Well, what we need are we need tests that direct and inform instruction in our classrooms. And when we are using a standardized test at the end of the year, and when you look at, this is from the State Board of Education's website. This is the intended uses of the Florida Standards Assessment. None of these are used, as you can see, to direct and inform instruction for students. It's only used for students for 3rd grade promotion, for 10th grade graduation eligibility, and the Algebra 1 EOC for graduation. This is all about teacher evaluation, school grade, school improvement, district grade, state accountability. But when we look at what the state has been trying to do since Jeb Bush, this is a 15-year experiment to speed the path to privatization, and they are using the state standardized test to do this, because the more that we make our teachers look like failures and our students look like they're failing, the faster we can sell our public schools off to private corporations, profiteering on the backs of our students.
You're shaking your head.
Well, I disagree. I think that's a little bit more of a conspiracy theory, if you will, but I think it's a blend. I think you're seeing education evolve into a very different environment, and I'm a huge advocate of getting out of the one-size-fits-all model, which is historically just the traditional public education, but it's evolving. Now, one thing that you mentioned, and obviously the testing is tied to standards, and there's been a huge debate, and I was adamantly opposed, and still am, on Common Core standards. And in Florida, we actually have an opportunity. We aren't part of a consortium when it relates to our testing model. What I would like to see us do is reevaluate our current standards in the state of Florida. I think there's a lot of debate on that, and then create and have it evolve to the right standards, and then have a testing model that
we have less than a minute left here, but I'm wondering, either one of you, the changes that are being proposed right now in Tallahassee, will that impact the kid who may be very bright, who may not test well on these standardized testing?
Yes, but ultimately it may not necessarily affect the student. It will affect the public school system. And when you bring up a different environment, charter schools are not different. They've been around for 30 years.
And they're tied to the same accountability measures.
No, they are not.
Charter schools in Florida are still required to take the FSA. That is not true.
We have got to take a break, and we'll wrap up the discussion in just a moment. When we return, we'll have final thoughts from our guests. Welcome back. Could proposed reforms to the state testing benefit students and teachers? Do we need broader changes to how we assess our children? Our guests join us right now for final thoughts. Bridget Ziegler, answer that question.
Clearly, this is a passionate debate, and it makes sense, because if you can't get passionate about our students and our future, then what can you get passionate about? When I got on the board in 2014, it was shortly right when the FSA had been first administered, and it was no doubt that it was sending shockwaves around. And and a couple other members around the state formed Florida Coalition of School Board Members, largely in part because of that issue, and wanting to work with legislators, having solution-oriented partnerships, so that it's not a pointing of fingers, but it's saying, let's sit around a table and figure out how we do this and incorporate people at the front lines, including our superintendents and our educators, to figure out how to get this, what that perfect balance is.
Obviously, you two do not agree on the issue of charter schools and the assessment based upon the tests as we were talking about, but it does seem that you agree on that the current testing has to change in some way.
Yes, most definitely. And I think we need to just stop choking off funding to our public schools, stop creating two separate but unequal public school systems, and start looking at wraparound services. These tests measure income, not outcome. Tells you where your zip code is, tells us where our children who are living in poverty are located within our counties and our cities. And until we start properly funding and providing these children with the proper wraparound services that they need to be successful, it'll be easier to take on diagnostic, teacher-written assessments.
We have only a couple seconds left, but let me give you the last word there.
Well, I keep going back to, we can go down that rabbit hole and we can talk about financial and this and that, but you cannot deny that there are outcomes in certain public schools that are failing students, and that I just caution where the conversation changes.
Okay, we have to leave it there. But thanks for both of our guests for being here tonight. Bridget Ziegler is on the Sarasota County School Board, and Bridget Hefferman Mendel is with the Manatee County Opt-Out